I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Dawn Warne. Last year, I got to introduce Don last year, and we were like, last time there was like a curtain we were behind, and his bio was all messed up, and I like made the corrections to his bio, and then I didn't follow it at all. I never said anything about his bio at all, because I ended up telling a story about when I figured out the first time he knew what my name was, and I was like freaking out because he was one of my public health heroes. And he's Beverly Warren's son, and that's incredible. One of my Indian heroes, Beverly Warren. But I'm actually going to read his bio this time. So Dr. Dawn Warne is the Associate Dean of Diversity and Equity and Inclusion at the Indians into Medicine Program, and the Indians into Medicine Program Director and Professor of Family and Community Medicine at the School of Medicine and Health Sciences at the University of North Dakota. He also serves as a Senior Policy Advisor to the Great Plains Tribal Chairman's Health Board, a member of the Oglala Lakota Tribe. Dr. Warren comes from a long line of traditional healers and medicine men. He received his medical degree from Stanford University of Medicine and his Master's of Public Health from Harvard School of Public Health. So that's a really impressive resume. But the thing that I appreciate most about Dr. Warren is his kindness, his compassion, and his dedication to ensuring that our students, that our people receive the very best care for one reason and one reason only. He loves Indian people. So please welcome Dr. Dawn Warren.
Hello, thank you, and welcome to all my relations here today. I'm very deeply honored to be a part of this discussion. In many ways, these topic areas are very difficult. Thinking about historical trauma, unresolved trauma, and some of the challenges that our people have faced now for many centuries. And how does that have an impact on health today, and what is the linkage between unresolved trauma and poor nutrition? And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the whole concept and the emerging science of epigenetics. I will talk a little bit about epigenetics today as well, basically as a scientific platform to try to better understand intergenerational impact of the social issues we've endured now for many generations. I also really like the theme of the conference, where we're blending indigenous wisdom and academic research. And for me, that is so vitally important to make sure that we are including the indigenous perspectives. And I always like to start any of these discussions with acknowledging the people who were here first, right? Whose land are we on right now? And when we look at this region, basically between what is now Minnesota and the Dakotas, there's reasons why it's called North Dakota and South Dakota. Actually, the colonizers were coming from the east, so they encountered the Dakotas first. Lakotas were further west, and Nakotas were to the south. So I always like to say, if the colonizers had come from the west, we'd have North Lakota and South Lakota. So I'd be at UNL instead of UND, but it just happened to be they came from that direction. And I always like to ask, how many people know what the word Minnesota means, just by a show of hands? A handful of people do. Most people don't. So Minnesota actually comes from two Dakota words. Mini is water, and Shota means cloudy or smoky. It's kind of a descriptive term. So Minnesota is literally the land of the smoky water, and this is a Minnesota. So this time of year, when the steam rises off of the water, this is actually a Minnesota. So that's Minnesota. So a lot of people don't realize that that's what a Minnesota is. And I'm sure we've heard of Minneapolis as well, right? People probably didn't realize that you're speaking in a bilingual way when you say Minneapolis. You're speaking Dakota Greek when you say that, actually. Polis is Greek for city, so Minneapolis. So I always think it's important to acknowledge the people who were here originally as our indigenous ancestors in this region. Well, I'm originally from Kyle, South Dakota, on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and the original name of Kyle is Pejutahaka, which means medicine root. And from this region, we have a lot of our traditional healers and medicine men who are from here historically, but even in modern times. I have several uncles who are traditional healers in this area. And when I think about my home community, there's so much richness of culture and so much beauty associated with our way of life, but we also deal with a lot of poverty. And we deal with a lot of nutritionally related challenges to our health. This is the cafe in Kyle, and I think what they've learned here is that you can bread and deep fry just about anything and serve it for lunch. So this is a food desert, so there's not easy access to healthy food choices, unfortunately. So it has to be things that can be stored for long periods of time, things that could be put in a bag and in a freezer, then thrown into a deep fryer. So obviously not healthy options, unfortunately. Right across the street from this cafe is a gas station that also doubles as a grocery store, so people do purchase food here. And as you can imagine, it's not the healthiest options. The closest supermarket to Kyle is 90 miles away in Rapid City. So 180-mile round trip in order to go to the supermarket. So even if you have good transportation and good weather, which we don't always have, that's still a hindrance. It's still a challenge in order to access healthy foods. So it is a food desert. We also, unfortunately, don't have easy access. And I'm so happy access was one of the key words that was identified. But we don't have easy access to healthy food choices. And one of the outcomes of that is terrible disparities. This is a picture of one of my relatives, and you can see he has an amputation. Why does he have a leg amputation? Poorly controlled diabetes, exactly. Isn't it remarkable we all just know that? If you had asked that question 40 years ago, people probably would have assumed maybe he was a combat veteran, right? But now we see amputation, diabetes. We've lowered the bar of expectation so much that that's just commonplace. So we don't invest in healthy food, and we don't acknowledge some of the historical factors that are leading to high rates of poverty, high rates of preventable disease and illness. So in Lakota, just like most of our indigenous language, we did not have a written language. So we learned about history and learned about cultural lessons through stories. And there's a story, and many of you I'm sure have heard this, but it's a story of three sisters walking along a river. And as they're walking along the river, they see babies and young children in the water struggling to stay afloat. And the first sister jumps into the water and says, "This is an emergency, it's a crisis. We need to get the babies out of the water right now." The second sister says, "No, we need to teach the babies how to swim so they can survive while they are in the water." And the third sister keeps walking upstream. And the other two get angry with her and say, "Where are you going? Why aren't you helping us?" And she says, "I'm going to find out who's putting these babies in the water, and I'm going to stop them." That's literally working further upstream. That literally is public health. So as we move forward with public health education, I always like to acknowledge public health is traditional medicine, right? Promoting health is traditional medicine. And promoting health and preventing disease is cultural-based health and healing. So this is very important to bring these worlds together of indigenous knowledge and academic research to try to get a better understanding of our health status and health outcomes. So there's been a lot of work in recent years looking at the social determinants of health. And these determinants include life-enhancing resources such as food supply, which again is a big challenge for us, adequate housing, economic development, social relationships, transportation, high-quality education, and healthcare. And the distribution of these determinants across populations has a huge impact on health status and quality of life. And even how long people live quite often are determined largely by social determinants of health, much more so than genetics. So what are some of the outcomes in North Dakota? This is just remarkable data. The average age at death in North Dakota for the white population is 77.4 years. For American Indians, 56.6 years, average age at death. This is in many ways third world health conditions right here in the heartland. And I like to remind my colleagues in academic public health, you do not need to cross an ocean to find third world health conditions, right? In our case, you just need to cross the Red River. It's just right here, it's that close and it's that challenging. So unfortunately, we don't have the appropriate attention paid to some of these disparities. When we look at diabetes death rates, we know it's much worse for the Indian Health Service population compared to the rest of the nation, but even worse in the Great Plains. And much of that, again, is due to high rates of poverty. So when we look at poverty rates, we know that we have higher rates of poverty for American Indians and Alaskan Natives nationally when we aggregate all of the data. But when we look at specific states like North Dakota, we see that the counties with the highest concentrations of poverty tend to be the reservation counties, and we see the exact same pattern in South Dakota. The poverty map is basically the reservation map. It's just really remarkable. Does poverty have an impact on your access to healthy food? Absolutely does. So as we're having this discussion, we have to understand that there are many challenges to American Indian nutrition, and access certainly is one of those issues, but it's even deeper than that. There are even other considerations. So when we look at our population now, there's only 7 states that have at least 3% indigenous population. That includes Alaska, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. And for my Alaska Native brothers and sisters, I apologize. I know Alaska's not off the coast of California, but this is the best map that I have here. So why is it that we're distributed mainly in the West? Is it because that historically Indians didn't like the East Coast? Too much traffic? Is that why we just weren't there? Well, the reason we're in the West is literally because colonization started in the East. If colonization had started in the West, this map would be reversed, quite frankly. So we have to acknowledge that there's a lot of damage that's been done to tribes that historically were in the Northeast. So when I show this picture, I always like to say, let's talk about Indian country. It's all Indian country, right? And we did not draw the lines between US and Canada or US and Mexico. Those were drawn for us. But if we just look at these 48 states, we know that the 13 colonies were not good for the Northeastern tribes. And I'm sure many of you have heard of Amherst, Massachusetts, and Amherst College, named after Lord Jeffrey Amherst. He was a colonial governor, and during that time frame, he's very famous. He's the one who ordered the distribution of blankets from a smallpox hospital to the regional tribes with the purpose of killing them. And this is actually documented. Our first documented case of bioterrorism is our own colonial government. But we don't talk about it in those terms. So you can actually look this up. You can Google it. I like how the word Google is a verb, but you can look this up. If you Google Amherst and smallpox, you'll even come up with this letter that he wrote. This is in his pen. And I know it's hard to read, but this is what he said. You will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, as well as to try every other method that can serve to extirpate or get rid of this execrable or horrible race. Extirpate this execrable race. I should be very glad your scheme for hunting them down by dogs could take effect. And now we have Amherst College, Amherst, Massachusetts, honoring him. This is a part of our history as indigenous peoples of this land. And ignoring the history is a huge disservice and significantly disrespectful to the memory and the ongoing intergenerational impact of our ancestors. Well, in the Southeast, you may have heard of the Indian Removal Act, also known as the Trail of Tears. This is when many of the tribes in the Southeast were relocated to what is now Oklahoma. And in that process, many of the tribal populations were split apart. Some of the tribal members said, no, I'm going to stay in my homelands. Others agreed to be removed to Oklahoma. So that's why we have Seminoles in Florida and Seminoles in Oklahoma. We have Cherokees in North Carolina, Cherokees in Oklahoma, Choctaws in Mississippi, Choctaws in Oklahoma, because of this process of removal. The discovery of gold was not good for the California tribes. There was actually a time in U.S. history in which it was legal to kill American Indians for a bounty. And not just in California, believe it or not, right here in Minnesota. You may have heard of the Dakota War of 1862. There was actually a bounty. You can see a Sioux scalp was worth $25 at this time frame. So the reason there are much less Dakotas left in Minnesota is because of this. There was a purposeful attempt at genocide, really to get rid of the Dakotas who were occupying this land. So of the 11 tribes, there's only 4 that are Dakota in Minnesota, and they're smaller communities, like this one right here is one of the smaller communities, along with Upper Sioux, Lower Sioux, and Prairie Island. So this was 1862, and this is what drove a lot of the Dakota people from what is now Minnesota into what is now North and South Dakota. This is from 1863. Someone sent me this newspaper clipping. It says, the state reward for dead Indians has been increased to $200 for every redskin sent to purgatory. The sum is more than the dead bodies of all the Indians east of the Red River are worth. This is phenomenal, isn't it? And this is a part of our history that's not talked about. And I understand why. It certainly doesn't shed a very happy light on the U.S., but I talk about these things not to make anyone feel bad. That's not the purpose. I talk about these things because it's the truth. And if we are ever going to get to equity, we have to walk through truth even when it's unpleasant, right? This is a part of our history. This is a part of the roots of historical trauma. This is a part of the roots of epigenetic changes that have had a huge impact on the health of our people. It's also at the root of many of the social determinants of health. When we think about all of that loss of territory, all of that loss of access to healthy food, that has an impact on health as well. So this is what we're left with. This map is actually from the U.S. Census website, and it shows concentration of American Indian and Alaska Native population by county. So you can see where our people are located, but there's a reason why our population is distributed in the way that it is. But right here in Minnesota, and certainly in the Dakotas and in this region, we are still here. We still have a lot of indigenous people. And we are here because we are resilient. We are here because we have strong people and strong cultures. And I'm actually excited about the future. I feel like we have a good future ahead of us. We just need to acknowledge the past and identify our best strategies moving forward. Our population was almost completely wiped out. It's estimated that in North America and South America, there are probably about 20 million indigenous people at the time of contact. And of that number, about 5 million in what is now the United States. By 1900, there was only 200,000 left. Isn't that amazing? From over 5 million to less than 200,000. So it was almost a complete genocide. The good news is, in the 2010 census, when you look at self-identified American Indian and Alaska Native, we're up to over 5 million again. So our population has rebounded. But is there a long-term impact on a population when you see this pattern of loss and this pattern of death and genocide, essentially? So I think we need to just come to terms with the fact that there was genocide in this country, a specific, purposeful attempt at getting rid of my ancestors and your ancestors. And this is where the whole idea of historical trauma really, I think, resonates with a lot of our people. We think of historical trauma as the collective emotional wounding across generations that results from massive cataclysmic events or historically traumatic events. And we've had a lot of those, and I've only touched on a handful of them. There's dozens and dozens of examples of atrocities that have occurred to American Indians. And this trauma can be held personally in each one of us, and it can be transmitted over generations. So even family members who didn't directly experience the trauma can still experience the effects of that trauma generations later. So I just want to briefly talk about epigenetics. Now, genetics, when we look at our genome, that's actually our DNA sequence. Epigenetics looks at changes to DNA based on external forces. The external forces could be toxic stress. When people live under a lot of stress, it actually changes their DNA expression. When people have a poor diet, particularly in utero, we see changes to gene expression. And we don't need to go into all the details in terms of the processes, but there's methylation of the DNA, the histones are impacted, telomeres, where the DNA actually divides and replicates, can be affected. And we see speeding up of the aging process when people are under tremendous amounts of stress. And when I think about our history, it's just a remarkable amount of stress that our people have faced over many generations, and that hasn't ended today, right? So let's even take a step further and look into some other impact on our populations. Boarding school experiences are in many ways unique to us as Indigenous peoples here in the U.S., and in many cases, our people were taken forcibly from their homes and placed in boarding schools, in some cases more than 1,000 miles away. I was just at Carlisle, just yesterday and the day before. There was a boarding school healing conference, and when you go there, it's just remarkable. This is the graveyard, the dead American Indian children who were boarding school residents at Carlisle Indian School. And what's so sad and devastating, there's many of these headstones that say unknown on them. Unknown. They didn't bother to know them, but they're buried there. And this is just very difficult. And the feeling, the atmosphere, it's just thick and heavy with sadness when I go there. But it's important to acknowledge this, and it's important to recognize that these ancestors did die, but they paved the way for us to be strong, right? That's part of who we are, and we have to acknowledge that, even when it's difficult. But this is a part of our history and part of that collective sense of loss that many of us feel. Well, that doesn't end there with the boarding school experiences, right? There's also gestational stressors. A lot of times we have high stress communities, and even when women are pregnant, they can be living under a great deal of stress and other types of social challenges that has an impact on the health of the babies. And then even when we look at our food programs, we've seen tremendous improvements in food programs through the USDA in recent years. But 10, 20 years ago, these were not healthy access food programs. So WIC, when I was working as a primary care doctor 20 years ago, the WIC program on the reservation where I was working was basically a baby formula distribution center. They're just handing out baby formula. And we know that babies who are breastfed grow up to have less diabetes and heart disease than babies who are formula fed. And just think about the whole word formula, right? Does that sound appetizing to anybody? You know, come on over, we'll have a glass of formula, right? It's called formula for a reason, right? It's chemicals. So we've had entire generations of American Indian children growing up with formula, as opposed to what the Creator had intended for us as families and as parents. FDPIR, Food Distribution Program on Indian Reservations, a commodity food program. And it's interesting, now when we think of traditional foods, and I'm so happy here we've had access to really healthy traditional foods, but now a lot of people, when they think traditional American Indian food, what do they think of? Fry bread. Did our ancestors fry dough? No. The origins of fry bread are in the commodity food program. People doing the best that they can with their commodities. So if we want to call fry bread traditional food, it's traditional USDA food. It's not traditional American Indian food. And that's just simply the truth. I love this image on the right, the elder using the commodity shortening and the commodity flour, making fry bread, right? And now when I go home for ceremonies or for feasts, there's an expectation that there will be fry bread because it's traditional, right? It's not. And part of our truth that we need to walk through is the recognition that this is not traditional. This is colonization. And we've latched onto it. We've embraced it. We've acculturated it. We own it. It's ours. But it's poison. And I think we all need to ask ourselves, would our ancestors be proud of us for feeding our children poison and calling it traditional? I think that's a question we all need to ask as Indigenous communities. This is not who we are. This is not our food. Here's a picture of commodities. I'm sure many of you recognize some of these images. That canned meat, some sort of almost like a spam-like meat product. I'm not exactly sure what that was. The commodity cheese, unfortunately, I think we all like commodity cheese. I wish we didn't, but it's one of those foods. On the right, that's a bottle of pure corn syrup. And if you look at it, it says use on your pancakes, and it says use in your baby formula on the label. Isn't that remarkable? So we've had generations of American Indian children growing up with this. Is this good for health? Well, absolutely not. In very direct ways, it's bad for health, but we're uncovering even more evidence of the epigenetic impact of poor nutrition, right? The stressor doesn't have to be emotional or mental stress. The stressor can be the food itself. So there's an evolving field of nutritional epigenetics that I think we need to take a deeper dive into. And I won't go into great detail with some of the existing studies. Just know none of the existing studies on nutritional epigenetics include American Indian populations, but there are populations around the country and around the world that have been studied. In this Illinois study, they did find black and white matched pairs of infants and mothers, and mothers who had low birth weight themselves tended to have their own children with low birth weight. And the father's birth weight had an impact as well. It was not as strong as the mother, but the father's birth weight did have an impact. So we do see that even nutritional status during pregnancy can have an impact across generations. There's also a famous Dutch famine study. This is because of what happened in 1944. There was a famine that lasted about 6 months, starting in November of 1944, and this is all related to World War II. So when Holland was finally liberated, they had this entire population of people who had lived through significant famine. And what they found is very strong evidence that at critical stages of development, so there were still women who were pregnant and having babies during this time frame, we saw significant negative health outcomes from famine. Fertility was decreased, maternal weight fell during pregnancy, and then they did see strong associations with infant mortality. Did we have changes to our nutrition, not just from the commodity food program, but loss of territory, loss of buffalo, loss of traditional farming? all of these things have occurred to our populations, and we address historical trauma, I think, appropriately through social determinants of health and looking at things like spiritual and emotional imbalance. But there's also nutritional imbalance that was a part of this equation that I think has not been adequately paid attention to. So famine in utero is very bad. Just in a very simple summary, famine exposure also led to higher rates of obesity in the children as they were making up for the loss of nutrition during pregnancy. So mothers exposed to famine prior to conception was strongly associated with lower reported mental health and quality of life in offspring. So we can see evidence that there's intergenerational transmission of poor nutrition to the next generation in terms of health status. And we know that we can see higher rates of obesity and poor health based on poor nutrition during pregnancy. And I won't go into the details of the theoretical framework behind this, but if you're interested, again, there's something you can Google if you'd look at nutritional epigenetics. And there's a lot of, I think, really good scientific theoretical framework behind why this is occurring and why the endpoints are things like diabetes, cancer, and heart disease. And this is something that has not been studied in our populations very well. So unfortunately, it doesn't end there. We still see adverse childhood experiences. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experiences study, in which we identify that the more adversity a child faces, the worse their health status is as an adult. And we know that adverse childhood experiences have an impact on neurological development. So the child's brain as it's developing can be negatively impacted. Also social and emotional impairment. Quite often these are the problem children at school because they've had a lot of instability at home. So what do? We kick them out of school, right? Even adding one more trauma to that child. And we see adoption of high-risk health behaviors and ultimately early death. And adverse childhood experiences are associated with things like depression and anxiety, PTSD, even suicidality and addiction. But we also see strong associations between adverse childhood experiences and diabetes and cancer and heart disease. So it's very predictive of poor health outcomes. And when I look at the list of poor health outcomes associated with ACEs, it's basically our health disparities, right? So that's tragic, but it's also an opportunity. Maybe there are things that we can do to address this. Does the adversity end at age 18? We become adults and everything's fine and dandy in our communities. Well, of course not. And I think the evolving science behind the impact of toxic stress is very important for our people. We do face high levels of toxic stress. We still have marginalization. We still have racism. We still have discrimination. Living in poverty and trying to provide for your family is very stressful. So all of these circumstances lead to chronic disease disparities going way back in time. And we have not yet taken a comprehensive approach to our chronic disease disparities. We tend to look at one of these issues in isolation without realizing the holistic nature of what we're talking about. And that's where indigenous wisdom is so important, right? We have to look at this more holistically. We have to look at this intergenerationally. We have to recognize that the land right here is the dust of our ancestors. We are connected to this place. And the changes that we've seen in our cultures has had a huge impact on the health of our current generations. Abused children, in many cases, eventually become parents, right? Even survivors of boarding schools. So where do we learn traditional parenting skills? And so we also see the cycle continuing, unfortunately, across generations. So this is kind of a theoretical framework to try to understand the intergenerational basis for chronic disease disparities that includes nutrition as a key element, but we have to look at the nutritional elements within a broader perspective that's more holistic. So as the co-principal investigator in what was called the South Dakota Health Survey, and in this survey we actually oversampled the tribal populations. 7 of the 9 tribes in South Dakota agreed to participate. We had over 8,000 survey respondents and over 520 American Indians. And it included standardized questions that we see in BRFIS, Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. We actually screened for mental health conditions, so not self-reported, but actually screened for things like depression, anxiety, alcohol use disorder, and we included the ACE questionnaire, Adverse Childhood Experiences. So what we saw in our sample was reflective of what we see in other data sets like census, where we have much higher rates of unemployment, much lower income, and lower educational attainment for American Indians, particularly in South Dakota, where we see very stark disparities across those social determinants of health, each of which also has an impact on your access to healthy food. It's remarkable how expensive healthy food is, right? The cheap food is the unhealthy food, and that's what we have access to in many cases. This is each of the 10 ACE domains, looking at abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And you can see at a p-value of less than 0.05, every single one of the ACE domains was significantly worse for American Indians in South Dakota. Every single one. We had some respondents who had an ACE score of 10, meaning they experienced all of these things. And not surprisingly, we see very poor health outcomes. Average age at death for men from Pine Ridge, where I am from, is now down to 48. Average age at death. I'm 52, so I guess it's all gravy from here, right? I've hit my longevity. But it should not be that way, right? The good news is there's things we can do about this, right? Do we have to continue the cycle of adversity among our children? We absolutely do not need to do that. So then, of course, with each of the 10 domains being worse, the overall ACE score was significantly higher for American Indians in South Dakota. In terms of screening for various mental health conditions like depression, anxiety, and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, much worse in the reservation populations as compared to other parts of the state, unfortunately. So what do we need to do? So we have significant research and programming needs. We need to improve our understanding of the impact of historical trauma. We need to improve our understanding of epigenetics and nutritional epigenetics in our populations. And not just for the academic exercise of doing this, but I work in circles where there are people who still doubt whether or not historical trauma is real. There are people who doubt that. Let's show them the data that it is real. And it follows multiple populations, not just American Indians. We have very good evidence from the Jewish population who were Holocaust survivors. So we need to have a better understanding of this, but it has to be done in a culturally relevant way, which means we need to do the research ourselves, right? It needs to be indigenous researchers looking at this issue and asking the right questions. We also need to prevent adverse childhood experiences. There's some emerging evidence that home visitation programs that include parenting skills and engaging the community have some positive impact in terms of preventing adversity in childhood. And I always like to ask the question, is poor nutrition an adverse childhood experience? It's not included in the list, but you bet it is an adverse childhood experience. And are many of our children facing poor nutrition, not 100 years ago, but today? Right now, poor nutrition in many of our homes, unfortunately. And for those who have suffered this, how do we mitigate the impact? How do we try to decrease the long-term impact of historical trauma and adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress? Part of the solution, I know we have to take a multi-pronged approach, but we need a diverse workforce working in health. And as was mentioned, I just recently moved to University of North Dakota, all the way from North Dakota State University, so about 65 miles away. But I'm now at the medical school, and I'm Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the medical school. It's not a pat on the back, but there's only 2 associate deans who are American Indian at medical schools in the country. Only 2 of us, and we're both at UND. So we have a shortage of leadership in medical training. The InMed program is Indians into Medicine. Since 1973, we've now graduated 237 American Indian physicians from UND. Before I'm done, let's quadruple that, right? Let's get into the thousands. That's what we need. We also need our own researchers, and I'm very happy to report, starting a new PhD program in Indigenous health. A PhD in Indigenous health. So it'll include principles of Indigenous health, defining our populations worldwide, looking at cultures, languages, impact of colonization, current health disparities. And it's remarkable how the trend of health disparities is consistent across Indigenous populations. But we also need well-trained researchers. We need to do our own research, and we need to be respectful of Indigenous methodologies. And all of those things are built into that curriculum. And when I think about the ways of our people historically, that we had healthy foods. Now, ironically, we didn't live as long as other populations because of infectious disease. So can we take the best of modern medical science, like management of infectious disease, and the best of indigenous knowledge and live in a healthier way? We can pull those things together if we choose to do it, but it's going to take a critical mass of us recognizing that these are our options moving forward. Let's take fry bread out of the equation and let's put buffalo back in, right? Now, I always like to end with this quote from our Blackfeet brothers and sisters. A child is sacred, and when that child comes into the home, the family must welcome it. And if the child is happy and feels the want, he will come into this world very, very strong. And not to know this is to know nothing. And not to know this is to know nothing. Traditional parenting and the way we would respect our children is powerful and meaningful medicine. And in our ways, for many of our tribes, it was the responsibility of one generation to raise the next generation. So I would be just as responsible for my nephew as I am for my son. And we've gone away from that. Even our definition of a family has been colonized, right? The nuclear family. We weren't just nuclear families. And does that sound good either? Also, nuclear family. Nuclear. That's not us. We need to take that colonization out of the equation as well and recognize that our children are sacred and we need to improve the health for them and for their children. And what we don't heal in ourselves, we hand on to our grandchildren. And I have selfish reasons for this. I have 4 children. Here are 2 of them. In the time of their grandchildren, let's not have to have this discussion anymore. Thank you all very much.